Chapter 52 of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 52. After a long time, the schoolmaster appeared at the wicket gate of the churchyard, and hurried towards them, tingling in his hand as he came along a bundle of rusty keys. He was quite breathless with pleasure and haste when he reached the porch, and at first could only point towards the old building which the child had been contemplating so earnestly. 'You see those two old houses?' he said at last.
'Yes, surely,' replied Nell. 'I have been looking at them nearly all the time you have been away.'
'And you would have looked at them more curiously yet if you could have guessed what I have to tell you,' said her friend. 'One of those houses is mine.'
Without saying any more, or giving the child time to reply, the schoolmaster took her hand, and, his honest face quite radiant with exultation, led her to the place of which he spoke. They stopped before its low arched door. After trying several of the keys in vain, the schoolmaster found one to fit the huge lock, which turned back, creaking, and admitted them into the house. The room into which they entered was a vaulted chamber, once nobly ornamented by cunning architects, and still retaining, in its beautiful groined roof and rich stone tracery, choice remnants of its ancient splendour. Foliage carved in the stone, and emulating the mastery of nature's hand, yet remained to tell how many times the leaves outside had come and gone, while it lived on unchanged. The broken figures supporting the burden of the chimney-piece, though mutilated, were still distinguishable for what they had been, far different from the dust without, and showed sadly by the empty hearth like creatures who had outlived their kind, and mourned their own too slow decay. In some old time, for even change was old in that old place, a wooden partition had been constructed in one part of the chamber to form a sleeping closet, into which the light was admitted at the same period by a rude window, or rather niche, cut in the solid wall. This screen, together with two seats in the broad chimney, had at some forgotten date been part of the church or convent, for the oak, hastily appropriated to its present purpose, had been little altered from its former shape, and presented to the eye a pile of fragments of rich carving from old monkish stalls. An open door leading to a small room or cell, dim with the light that came through leaves of ivy, completed the interior of this portion of the ruin. It was not quite destitute of furniture. A few strange chairs, whose arms and legs looked as though they had dwindled away with age, a table, the very spectre of its race, a great old chest that had once held records in the church, with other quaintly fashioned domestic necessaries, and store of firewood for the winter, were scattered around, and gave evident tokens of its occupation as a dwelling-place at no very distant time. The child looked around her, with that solemn feeling with which we contemplate the work of ages that have become but drops of water in the great ocean of eternity. The old man had followed them, but they were all three hushed for a space, and drew their breath softly, as if they feared to break the silence, even by so slight a sound.
'It is a very beautiful place,' said the child in a low voice.
'I almost feared you thought otherwise,' returned the schoolmaster. 'You shivered when we first came in, as if you felt it cold or gloomy.'
'It was not that,' said Nell, glancing round with a slight shudder. 'Indeed, I cannot tell you what it was, but when I saw the outside from the church porch, the same feeling came over me. It is its being so old and grey, perhaps.'
'A peaceful place to live in, don't you think so?' said her friend.
'Oh, yes,'
rejoined the child, clasping her hands earnestly.
'A quiet, happy place. A place to live and learn to die in.'
She would have said more, but that the energy of her thoughts caused her voice to falter, and come in trembling whispers from her lips.
'A place to live and learn to live, and gather health of mind and body in,' said the schoolmaster, 'for this old house is yours.
'Hours!'
cried the child. 'Ay!' returned the schoolmaster gaily. 'For many a merry year to come, I hope. I shall be a close neighbour, only next door, but this house is yours.' Having now disburdened himself of his great surprise, the schoolmaster sat down, and drawing Nell to his side, told her how he had learnt that ancient tenement had been occupied for a very long time by an old person, nearly 100 years of age, who kept the keys of the church, opened it and closed it for the services, and showed it to strangers. How she had died not many weeks ago, and nobody had yet been found to fill the office. How, learning all this in an interview with the sexton, who was confined to his bed by rheumatism, he had been bold to make mention of his fellow traveller, which had been so favourably received by that high authority, that he had taken courage, acting on his advice, to propound the matter to the clergyman. In a word, the result of his exertions was, that Nell and her grandfather were to be carried before the last named gentleman next day, and his approval of their conduct and appearance reserved as a matter of form, that they were already appointed to the vacant post. 'There's a small allowance of money,' said the schoolmaster. 'It is not much, but still enough to live upon in this retired spot. By clubbing our funds together, we shall do bravely, no fear of that.'
'Heaven bless and prosper you!'
sobbed the child. 'Amen, my dear,' returned her friend cheerfully. 'And all of us, as it will, and has, in leading us through sorrow and trouble to this tranquil life. But we must look at my house now. Come.' They repaired to the other tenement, tried the rusty keys as before, at length found the right one, and opened the worm-eaten door. It led into a chamber, vaulted and old, like that from which they had come, but not so spacious, and having only one other little room attached. It was not difficult to divine that the other house was of right the schoolmaster's, and that he had chosen for himself the least commodious in his care and regard for them. Like the adjoining habitation, it held such old articles of furniture as were absolutely necessary, and had its stack of firewood. To make these dwellings as habitable and full of comfort as they could, was now their pleasant care. In a short time, each had its cheerful fire glowing and crackling on the hearth, and reddening the pale old wall with a hale and healthy blush. Nell, busily plying her needle, repaired the tattered window hangings, drew together the rents that time had worn in the threadbare scraps of carpet, and made them whole and decent. The schoolmaster swept and smoothed the ground before the door, trimmed the long grass, trained the ivy and creeping plants which hung their drooping heads in melancholy neglect, and gave to the outer walls a cheery air of home. The old man, sometimes by his side and sometimes with the child, lent his aid to both, went here and there on little patient services, and was happy. Neighbours, too, as they came from work, proffered their help, or sent their children with such small presents or loans as the strangers needed most. It was a busy day, and night came on and found them wondering that there was yet so much to do, and that it should be dark so soon. They took their supper together in the house which may be henceforth called the child's, and, when they had finished their meal, drew round the fire, and almost in whispers, their hearts were too quiet and glad for loud expression, discussed their future plans. Before they separated, the schoolmaster read some prayers aloud, and then, full of gratitude and happiness, they parted for the night. At that silent hour when her grandfather was sleeping peacefully in his bed, and every sound was hushed, the child lingered before the dying embers, and thought of her past fortunes as if they had been a dream, and she only now awoke. The glare of the sinking flame, reflected in the oaken panels whose carved tops were dimly seen in the dusky roof, the aged walls where strange shadows came and went with every flickering of the fire, the solemn presence within of that decay which falls on senseless things the most enduring in their nature, and without and round about on every side, of death, filled her with deep and thoughtful feelings, but with none of terror or alarm. A change had been gradually stealing over her in the time of her loneliness and sorrow. With failing strength and heightening resolution,
there had sprung up a purified and altered mind. There had grown in her bosom blessed thoughts and hopes, which are the portion of few, but the weak and drooping. There were none to see the frail perishable figure, as it glided from the fire, and leaned pensively at the open casement; none but the stars, to look into the upturned face, and read its history. The old church bell rang out the hour with a mournful sound, as if it had grown sad from so much communing with the dead and unheeded warning to the living. The fallen leaves rustled, the grass stirred upon the graves, all else was still and sleeping. Some of those dreamless sleepers lay close within the shadow of the church, touching the wall as if they clung to it for comfort and protection. Others had chosen to lie beneath the changing shade of trees, others by the path, that footsteps might come near them, others among the graves of little children. Some had desired to rest beneath the very ground they had trodden in their daily walks, some where the setting sun might shine upon their beds, some where its light would fall upon them when it rose. Perhaps not one of the imprisoned souls had been able quite to separate itself in living thought from its old companion. If any had, it had still felt for it a love like that which captives have been known to bear towards the cell in which they have been long confined, and even at parting hung upon its narrow bounds affectionately. It was long before the child closed the window and approached her bed. Again something of the same sensation as before, an involuntary chill, a momentary feeling akin to fear, but vanishing directly, and leaving no alarm behind. Again, too, dreams of the little scholar, of their roof opening, and a column of bright faces rising far away into the sky, as she had seen in some old scriptural picture once, and looking down on her, asleep. It was a sweet and happy dream. The quiet spot outside seemed to remain the same, saving that there was music in the air and a sound of angels' wings. After a time the sisters came there, hand in hand, and stood among the graves, and then the dream grew dim and faded. With the brightness and joy of morning came the renewal of yesterday's labours, the revival of its pleasant thoughts, the restoration of its energies, cheerfulness, and hope. They worked gaily in ordering and arranging their houses until noon, and then went to visit the clergyman. He was a simple-hearted old gentleman of a shrinking, subdued spirit, accustomed to retirement, and very little acquainted with the world, which he had left many years before to come and settle in that place. His wife had died in the house in which he still lived, and he had long since lost sight of any earthly cares or hopes beyond it. He received them very kindly, and at once showed an interest in Nell, asking her name and age, her birthplace, the circumstances which had led her there, and so forth. The schoolmaster had already told her story. They had no other friends or home to leave, he said, and had come to share his fortunes. He loved the child as though she were his own. 'Well, well,' said the clergyman, 'let it be as you desire. She is very young.' 'Old in adversity and trial, sir,' replied the schoolmaster. 'God help her. Let her rest and forget them,' said the old gentleman. 'But an old church is a dull and gloomy place for one so young as you, my child.'
'Oh no, sir,' returned Nell. 'I have no such thoughts indeed.'
'I would rather see her dancing on the green at nights,' said the old gentleman, laying his hand upon her head, and smiling sadly, 'than have her sitting in the shadow of our mouldering arches. You must look to this, and see that her heart does not grow heavy among these solemn ruins. Your request is granted, friend.' After more kind words, they withdrew, and repaired to the child's house, where they were yet in conversation on their happy fortune, when another friend appeared. This was a little old gentleman who lived in the parsonage house, and had resided there, so they learnt soon afterwards, ever since the death of the clergyman's wife, which had happened 15 years before. He had been his college friend, and always his close companion. In the first shock of his grief he had come to console and comfort him, and from that time they had never parted company. The little old gentleman was the active spirit of the place,
the adjuster of all differences, the promoter of all merrymakings, the dispenser of his friend's bounty, and of no small charity of his own besides, the universal mediator, comforter, and friend. None of the simple villagers had cared to ask his name, or, when they knew it, to store it in their memory. Perhaps from some vague rumour of his college honours which had been whispered abroad on his first arrival, perhaps because he was an unmarried, unencumbered gentleman, he had been called the Bachelor. The name pleased him, or suited him as well as any other, and the bachelor he had ever since remained. And the bachelor it was, it may be added, who with his own hands had laid in the stock of fuel which the wanderers had found in their new habitation. The bachelor then, to call him by his usual appellation, lifted the latch, showed his little round mild face for a moment at the door, and stepped into the room like one who was no stranger to it. 'You are Mr Martin, the new schoolmaster?' he said, greeting Nell's kind friend. 'I am, sir.' 'You come well recommended, and I am glad to see you. I should have been in the way yesterday, expecting you, but I rode across the country to carry a message from a sick mother to her daughter in service some miles off, and have but just now returned. This is our young church-keeper. You are not the less welcome, friend, for her sake, or for this old man's, nor the worse teacher for having learnt humanity.' 'She has been ill, sir, very lately,' said the schoolmaster, in answer to the look with which their visitor regarded Nell when he had kissed her cheek. 'Yes, yes, I know she has,' he rejoined. 'There have been suffering and heartache here.' 'Indeed there have, sir.' The little old gentleman glanced at the grandfather, and back again at the child, whose hand he took tenderly in his, and held. 'You will be happier here,' he said. 'We will try, at least, to make you so. You have made great improvements here already. Are they the work of your hands?'
'Yes, sir.'
'We may make some others. Not better in themselves, but with better means, perhaps,' said the bachelor. 'Let us see now. Let us see.' Nell accompanied him into the other little rooms, and over both the houses, in which he found various small comforts wanting, which he engaged to supply from a certain collection of odds and ends he had at home, and which must have been a very miscellaneous and extensive one, as it comprehended the most opposite articles imaginable. They all came, however, and came without loss of time, for the little old gentleman, disappearing for some 5 or 10 minutes, presently returned laden with old shelves, rugs, blankets, and other household gear, and followed by a boy bearing a similar load. These being cast on the floor in a promiscuous heap, yielded a quantity of occupation in arranging, erecting, and putting away, the superintendence of which task evidently afforded the old gentleman extreme delight, and engaged him for some time with great briskness and activity. When nothing more was left to be done, he charged the boy to run off and bring his schoolmates to be marshalled before their new master, and solemnly reviewed. 'As good a set of fellows, Martin, as you'd wish to see,' he said, turning to the schoolmaster when the boy was gone. 'But I don't let 'em know I think so. That wouldn't do at all.' The messenger soon returned at the head of a long row of urchins, great and small, who, being confronted by the bachelor at the house door, fell into various convulsions of politeness, clutching their hats and caps, squeezing them into the smallest possible dimensions, and making all manner of bows and scrapes, which the little old gentleman contemplated with excessive satisfaction, and expressed his approval of by a great many nods and smiles. Indeed, his approbation of the boys was by no means so scrupulously disguised as he had led the schoolmaster to suppose, inasmuch as it broke out in sundry loud whispers and confidential remarks, which were perfectly audible to them, every one. 'This first boy, schoolmaster,' said the bachelor, 'is John Owen, a lad of good parts, sir, and frank, honest temper, but too thoughtless, too playful, too light-headed by far. That boy, my good sir, would break his neck with pleasure, and deprive his parents of their chief comfort. and between ourselves, when you come to see him at hare and hounds, taking the fence and ditch by the finger post, and sliding down the face of the little quarry, you'll never forget it. It's beautiful.' John Owen having been thus rebuked, and being in perfect possession of the speech aside, the bachelor singled out another boy. 'Now look at that lad, sir,' said the bachelor. 'You see that fellow? Richard Evans his name is, sir. An amazing boy to learn, blessed with a good memory, and a ready understanding, and moreover with a good voice and ear for psalm singing, in which he is the best among us. Yet, sir, that boy will come to a bad end. He'll never die in his bed. He's always falling asleep in sermon time, and to tell you the truth, Mr Martin, I always did the same at his age, and feel quite certain that it was natural to my constitution, and I couldn't help it.' This hopeful pupil, edified by the above terrible reproval, the bachelor turned to another. 'But if we talk of examples to be shunned,' said he, 'if we come to boys that should be a warning and a beacon to all their fellows, here's the one, and I hope you won't spare him. This is the lad, sir. This one with the blue eyes and light hair. This is a swimmer, sir. This fellow, a diver. Lord save us! This is a boy, sir, who had a fancy for plunging into 18 feet of water with his clothes on, and bringing up a blind man's dog, who was being drowned by the weight of his chain and collar, while his master stood wringing his hands upon the bank, bewailing the loss of his guide and friend. I sent the boy 2 guineas anonymously, sir,' added the bachelor in his peculiar whisper, 'directly I heard of it, but never mention it on any account, for he hasn't the least idea that it came from me.' Having disposed of this culprit, the bachelor turned to another, and from him to another, and so on through the whole array, laying for their wholesome restriction within due bounds the same cutting emphasis on such of their propensities as were dearest to his heart, and were unquestionably referable to his own precept and example. Thoroughly persuaded in the end that he had made them miserable by his severity, he dismissed them with a small present, and an admonition to walk quietly home, without any leapings, scufflings, or turnings out of the way, which injunction he informed the schoolmaster in the same audible confidence he did not think he could have obeyed when he was a boy, had his life depended on it. Hailing these little tokens of the bachelor's disposition as so many assurances of his own welcome course from that time, the schoolmaster parted from him with a light heart and joyous spirits, and deemed himself one of the happiest men on earth. The windows of the 2 old houses were ruddy again that night, with the reflection of the cheerful fires that burnt within, and the bachelor and his friend, pausing to look upon them as they returned from their evening walk, spoke softly together of the beautiful child, and looked round upon the churchyard with a sigh. End of chapter 52. Chapter 53 of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 53. Nell was stirring early in the morning, and having discharged her household tasks and put everything in order for the good schoolmaster, though sorely against his will, for he would have spared her the pains, took down from its nail by the fireside a little bundle of keys with which the bachelor had formally invested her on the previous day, and went out alone to visit the old church. The sky was serene and bright, the air clear, perfumed with the fresh scent of newly fallen leaves, and grateful to every sense. The neighbouring stream sparkled and rolled onward with a tuneful sound. The dew glistened on the green mounds, like tears shed by good spirits over the dead. Some young children sported among the tombs, and hid from each other with laughing faces. They had an infant with them, and had laid it down asleep upon a child's grave in a little bed of leaves. It was a new grave, the resting place, perhaps, of some little creature, who, meek and patient in its illness, had often sat and watched them, and now seemed, to their minds, scarcely changed. She drew near and asked one of them whose grave it was. The child answered that that was not its name. It was a garden. His brother's. It was greener, he said, than all the other gardens, and the birds loved it better because he had been used to feed them. When he had done speaking, he looked at her with a smile, and kneeling down and nestling for a moment with his cheek against the turf, bounded merrily away. She passed the church, gazing upward at its old tower, went through the wicket gate, and so into the village. The old sexton, leaning on a crutch, was taking the air at his cottage door, and gave her good morrow.
'You are better,'
said the child, stopping to speak with him.
'Ay, surely,' returned the old man. 'I'm thankful to say, much better.'
'You will be quite well soon.'
'With Heaven's leave and a little patience. But come in, come in.'
The old man limped on before, and warning her of the downward step, which he achieved himself with no small difficulty, led the way into his little cottage.
'It is but one room, you see. There is another up above, but the stair has got harder to climb o' late years, and I never use it. I'm thinking of taking to it again next summer, though.'
The child wondered how a grey-headed man like him, one of his trade too, could talk of time so easily. He saw her eyes wandering to the tools that hung upon the wall, and smiled.
'I warrant now,' he said, 'that you think all those are used in making graves.'
'Indeed, I wondered that you wanted so many.'
'And well you might. I am a gardener. I dig the ground, and plant things that are to live and grow. My works don't all moulder away and rot in the earth. You see that spade in the centre?'
'The very old one, so notched and worn? Yes.'
'That's the sexton's spade, and it's a well-used one, as you see. We're healthy people here, but it has done a power of work. If it could speak now, that spade, it would tell you of many an unexpected job that it and I have done together. But I forget 'em, for my memory's a poor one. That's nothing new,' he added hastily. 'It always was.'
'There are flowers and shrubs to speak to your other work,' said the child.
'Oh yes, and tall trees. But they are not so separate from the sexton's labours as you think.'
'No?'
'Not in my mind and recollection, such as it is,' said the old man. 'Indeed, they often help it. For say that I planted such a tree for such a man. There it stands to remind me that he died. When I look at its broad shadow, and remember what it was in his time, it helps me to the age of my other work, and I can tell you pretty nearly when I made his grave.'
'But it may remind you of one who is still alive,' said the child.
'Of 20 that are dead, in connection with that one who lives then,' rejoined the old man. 'Wife, husband, parents, brothers, sisters, children, friends, a score at least. So it happens that the sexton's spade gets worn and battered. I shall need a new one next summer.'
The child looked quickly towards him, thinking that he jested with his age and infirmity. But the unconscious sexton was quite in earnest. 'Ah!' he said after a brief silence.
'People never learn. They never learn. It's only we who turn up the ground where nothing grows and everything decays, who think of such things as these, who think of them properly, I mean. You have been into the church?'
'I am going there now,'
the child replied.
'There's an old well there,' said the sexton, 'right underneath the belfry. A deep, dark, echoing well. 40 year ago,
You had only to let down the bucket till the first knot in the rope was free of the windlass, and you heard it splashing in the cold dull water. By little and little the water fell away, so that in 10 years after that a second knot was made, and you must unwind so much rope, or the bucket swung tight and empty at the end. In 10 years' time the water fell again, and a third knot was made. In 10 years more the well dried up, and now, if you lower the bucket till your arms are tired, and let out nearly all the cord, you'll hear it, of a sudden, clanking and rattling on the ground below, with a sound of being so deep and so far down that your heart leaps into your mouth, and you start away as if you were falling in. 'A dreadful place to come on in the dark!'
exclaimed the child, who had followed the old man's looks and words until she seemed to stand upon its brink.
'What is it but a grave?' said the sexton. 'What else? And which of our old folks, knowing all this, thought, as the spring subsided, of their own failing strength and lesson in life? Not one.' 'Are you very old yourself?' asked the child involuntarily. 'I shall be 79 next summer.' 'You still work when you are well?' 'Work? To be sure. You shall see my gardens hereabout. Look at the window there. I made and have kept that plot of ground entirely with my own hands. By this time next year I shall hardly see the sky, the boughs will have grown so thick. I have my winter work at night besides.'
He opened, as he spoke, a cupboard close to where he sat, and produced some miniature boxes, carved in a homely manner and made of old wood.
'Some gentlefolks who are fond of ancient days and what belongs to them,' he said, 'like to buy these keepsakes from our church and ruins. Sometimes I make them of scraps of oak that turn up here and there, sometimes of bits of coffins which the vaults have long preserved. See here, this is a little chest of the last kind, clasped at the edges with fragments of brass plates that had writing on 'em once, though it would be hard to read it now. I haven't many by me at this time of year, but these shelves will be full next summer.'
The child admired and praised his work, and shortly afterwards departed, thinking as she went how strange it was that this old man, drawing from his pursuits and everything around him one stern moral, never contemplated its application to himself, and while he dwelt upon the uncertainty of human life, seemed both in word and deed to deem himself immortal. But her musings did not stop here, for she was wise enough to think that by a good and merciful adjustment this must be human nature, and that the old sexton, with his plans for next summer, was but a type of all mankind. Full of these meditations, she reached the church. It was easy to find the key belonging to the outer door, for each was labelled on a scrap of yellow parchment. Its very turning in the lock awoke a hollow sound, and when she entered with a faltering step, the echoes that it raised in closing made her start. If the peace of the simple village had moved the child more strongly, because of the dark and troubled ways that lay beyond, and through which she had journeyed with such failing feet, what was the deep impression of finding herself alone in that solemn building, where the very light coming through sunken windows seemed old and grey, and the air, redolent of earth and mould, seemed laden with decay, purified by time of all its grosser particles, and sighing through arch and aisle and clustered pillars like the breath of ages gone. Here was the broken pavement, worn so long ago by pious feet, that time, stealing on the pilgrims' steps, had trodden out their track and left but crumbling stones. Here were the rotten beam, the sinking arch, the sapped and mouldering wall, the lowly trench of earth, the stately tomb on which no epitaph remained, all marble, stone, iron, wood, and dust, one common monument of ruin. The best work and the worst, the plainest and the richest, the stateliest and the least imposing, both of heaven's work and man's, all found one common level here, and told one common tale. Some part of the edifice had been a baronial chapel, and here were effigies of warriors stretched upon their beds of stone with folded hands, cross-legged, those who had fought in the holy wars, girded with their swords and cased in armour as they had lived. Some of these knights had their own weapons, helmets, coats of mail, hanging upon the walls hard by, and dangling from rusty hooks. Broken and dilapidated as they were, they yet retained their ancient form, and something of their ancient aspect. Thus violent deeds live after men upon the earth, and traces of war and bloodshed will survive in mournful shapes, long after those who worked the desolation are but atoms of earth themselves. The child sat down in this old silent place among the stark figures on the tombs. They made it more quiet there than elsewhere to her fancy, and gazing round with a feeling of awe tempered with a calm delight, felt that now she was happy and at rest. She took a Bible from the shelf and read, then laying it down, thought of the summer days and the bright springtime that would come, of the rays of sun that would fall in a slant upon the sleeping forms, of the leaves that would flutter at the window and play in glistening shadows on the pavement, of the songs of birds and growth of buds and blossoms out of doors, of the sweet air that would steal in and gently wave the tattered banners overhead. What if the spot awakened thoughts of death? Die who would, it would still remain the same. These sights and sounds would still go on as happily as ever. It would be no pain to sleep amidst them. She left the chapel, very slowly and often turning back to gaze again, and coming to a low door which plainly led into the tower, opened it and climbed the winding stair in darkness, save where she looked down through narrow loopholes on the place she had left, or caught a glimmering vision of the dusty bells. At length she gained the end of the ascent, and stood upon the turret's top. Oh, the glory of the sudden burst of light! The freshness of the fields and woods stretching away on every side, and meeting the bright blue sky! The cattle grazing in the pasturage! The smoke that, coming from among the trees, seemed to rise upward from the green earth! The children yet at their gambols down below! All, everything, so beautiful and happy! It was like passing from death to life. It was drawing nearer heaven. The children were gone when she emerged into the porch and locked the door. As she passed the schoolhouse, she could hear the busy hum of voices. Her friend had begun his labours only on that day. The noise grew louder, and looking back, she saw the boys come trooping out and disperse themselves with merry shouts and play.
It's a good thing, thought the child. I am very glad they passed the church.
And then she stopped, to fancy how the noise would sound inside, and how gently it would seem to die away upon the ear. Again that day, yes, twice again, she stole back to the old chapel, and in her former seat read from the same book, or indulged the same quiet train of thought. Even when it had grown dusk, and the shadows of coming night made it more solemn still, the child remained, like one rooted to the spot, and had no fear or thought of stirring. They found her there at last, and took her home. She looked pale, but very happy, until they separated for the night, and then, as the poor schoolmaster stooped down to kiss her cheek, he thought he felt a tear upon his face. End of chapter 53. Chapter 54 of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 54. The bachelor, among his various occupations, found in the old church a constant source of interest and amusement. Taking that pride in it which men conceive for the wonders of their own little world, he had made its history his study, and many a summer day within its walls, and many a winter's night beside the parsonage fire, had found the bachelor still poring over, and adding to, his goodly store of tale and legend. As he was not one of those rough spirits who would strip fair truth of every little shadowy vestment in which time and teeming fancies love to array her, and some of which become her pleasantly enough, serving, like the waters of her well, to add new graces to the charms they half conceal and half suggest, and to awaken interest and pursuit rather than languor and indifference, as, unlike this stern and obdurate class, he loved to see the goddess crowned with those garlands of wild flowers which tradition wreaths for her gentle wearing, and which are often freshest in their homeliest shapes. He trod with a light step and bore with a light hand upon the dust of centuries, unwilling to demolish any of the airy shrines that had been raised above it, if any good feeling or affection of the human heart were hiding thereabouts. Thus, in the case of an ancient coffin of rough stone, supposed for many generations to contain the bones of a certain baron, who, after ravaging, with cut and thrust and plunder, in foreign lands, came back with a penitent and sorrowing heart to die at home, but which had been lately shown by learned antiquaries to be no such thing, as the baron in question, so they contended, had died hard in battle, gnashing his teeth and cursing with his latest breath. The bachelor stoutly maintained that the old tale was the true one, that the baron, repenting him of the evil, had done great charities, and meekly given up the ghost, and that if ever baron went to heaven, that baron was then at peace. In like manner, when the aforesaid antiquaries did argue and contend that a certain secret vault was not the tomb of a grey-haired lady who had been hanged and drawn and quartered by glorious Queen Bess for succouring a wretched priest who fainted of thirst and hunger at her door, the bachelor did solemnly maintain, against all comers, that the church was hallowed by the said poor lady's ashes, that her remains had been collected in the night from 4 of the city's gates, and thither in secret brought and there deposited. And the bachelor did further, being highly excited at such times, deny the glory of Queen Bess, and assert the immeasurably greater glory of the meanest woman in her realm who had a merciful and tender heart. As to the assertion that the flat stone near the door was not the grave of the miser who had disowned his only child and left a sum of money to the church to buy a peal of bells, the bachelor did readily admit the same, and that the place had given birth to no such man. In a word, he would have had every stone and plate of brass the monument only of deeds whose memory should survive. All others he was willing to forget. They might be buried in consecrated ground, but he would have had them buried deep, and never brought to light again. It was from the lips of such a tutor that the child learnt her easy task. Already impressed beyond all telling by the silent building and the peaceful beauty of the spot in which it stood, majestic age surrounded by perpetual youth, it seemed to her, when she heard these things sacred to all goodness and virtue. It was another world, where sin and sorrow never came, a tranquil place of rest, where nothing evil entered. When the bachelor had given her in connection with almost every tomb and flat gravestone some history of its own, he took her down into the old crypt, now a mere dull vault, and showed her how it had been lighted up in the time of the monks, and how, amid lamps depending from the roof, and swinging censers exhaling scented odours, and habits glittering with gold and silver, and pictures and precious stuffs, and jewels all flashing and glistening through the low arches, the chaunt of aged voices had been many a time heard there, at midnight, in old days, while hooded figures knelt and prayed around, and told their rosaries of beads. Thence he took her above ground again, and showed her, high up in the old walls, small galleries where the nuns had been wont to glide along, dimly seen in their dark dresses so far off, or to pause, like gloomy shadows, listening to the prayers. He showed her, too, how the warriors, whose figures rested on the tombs, had worn those rotting scraps of armour up above. How this had been a helmet, and that a shield, and that a gauntlet, and how they had wielded the great two-handed swords, and beaten men down with yonder iron mace. All that he told the child, she treasured in her mind, and sometimes when she awoke at night from dreams of those old times, and rising from her bed looked out at the dark church, she almost hoped to see the windows lighted up, and hear the organs swell and sound of voices on the rushing wind. The old sexton soon got better, and was about again. From him the child learnt many other things, though of a different kind. He was not able to work, but one day there was a grave to be made, and he came to overlook the man who dug it. He was in a talkative mood, and the child, at first standing by his side, and afterwards sitting on the grass at his feet, with her thoughtful face raised towards his, began to converse with him. Now, the man who did the sexton's duty was a little older than he, though much more active, but he was deaf, and when the sexton, who peradventure, on a pinch, might have walked a mile with great difficulty in half a dozen hours, exchanged a remark with him about his work, the child could not help noticing that he did so with an impatient kind of pity for his infirmity, as if he were himself the strongest and heartiest man alive.
'I am sorry to see there is this to do,' said the child when she approached. 'I heard of no one having died.'
'She lived in another hamlet, my dear,' returned the sexton, 3 mile away.'
'Was she young?'
'Yes,' said the sexton. 'Not more than 64, I think. David, was she more than 64? David, who was digging hard, heard nothing of the question. The sexton, as he could not reach to touch him with his crutch, and was too infirm to rise without assistance, called his attention by throwing a little mould upon his red nightcap. 'What's the matter now?' said David, looking up. 'How old was Becky Morgan?' asked the sexton. 'Becky Morgan?' repeated David. 'Yes,' replied the sexton, adding in a half compassionate, half irritable tone, which the old man couldn't hear, 'You're getting very deaf, Davy, very deaf to be sure.' The old man stopped in his work, and cleansing his spade with a piece of slate he had by him for the purpose, and scraping off, in the process, the essence of heaven knows how many Becky Morgans, set himself to consider the subject. 'Let me think,' quoth he. 'I saw last night what they had put upon the coffin. Was it 79? No, no,' said the sexton. 'Ah, yes, it was though,' returned the old man with a sigh. 'For I remember thinking she was very near our age. Yes, it was 79. Are you sure you didn't mistake a figure, Davy?' asked the sexton, with signs of some emotion. 'What?' said the old man. 'Say that again.' 'He's very deaf. He's very deaf indeed,' cried the sexton petulantly. 'Are you sure you're right about the figures?' 'Oh, quite,' replied the old man. 'Why not?' 'He's exceedingly deaf,' muttered the sexton to himself. 'I think he's getting foolish.' The child rather wondered what had led him to this belief, as, to say the truth, the old man seemed quite as sharp as he, and was infinitely more robust. As the sexton said nothing more just then, however, she forgot it for the time, and spoke again. 'You were telling me,' she said, 'about your gardening. Do you ever plant things here?' 'In the churchyard?' returned the sexton. 'Not I.' 'I have seen some flowers and little shrubs about,' the child rejoined. 'There are some over there, you see. I thought they were of your rearing, though indeed they grow but poorly.' 'They grow as Heaven wills,' said the old man, 'and it kindly ordains that they shall never flourish here.' 'I do not understand you.' 'Why, this it is,' said the sexton. 'They mark the graves of those who had very tender, loving friends.
I was sure they did, the child exclaimed. I'm very glad to know they do. Aye, returned the old man. But stay. Look at them. See how they hang their heads and droop and wither. Do you guess the reason? No, the child replied. Because the memory of those who lie below passes away so soon. At first they tend them morning, noon, and night. They soon begin to come less frequently. From once a day to once a week, from once a week to once a month, then at long and uncertain intervals, then not at all. Such tokens seldom flourish long. I have known the briefest summer flowers outlive them. I grieve to hear it, said the child. Ah, so say the gentlefolks who come down here to look about them, returned the old man, shaking his head. But I say otherwise. It's a pretty custom you have in this part of the country, they say to me sometimes, to plant the graves. But it's melancholy to see these things all withering or dead. I crave their pardon, and tell them that, as I take it, 'tis a good sign for the happiness of the living. And so it is. It's nature. Perhaps the mourners learn to look to the blue sky by day, and to the stars by night, and to think that the dead are there, and not in graves, said the child in an earnest voice. Perhaps so, replied the old man doubtfully. It may be. Whether it be as I believe it is or no, thought the child within herself, I'll make this place my garden. It will be no harm, at least, to work here day by day, and pleasant thoughts will come of it, I am sure. Her glowing cheek and moistened eye passed unnoticed by the sexton, who turned towards old David and called him by his name. It was plain that Becky Morgan's age still troubled him, though why, the child could scarcely understand. The second or third repetition of his name attracted the old man's attention. Pausing from his work, he leant on his spade and put his hand to his dull ear. "Did you call?" he said. "I have been thinking, Davy," replied the sexton, "that she," he pointed to the grave, "must have been a deal older than you or me." 79, answered the old man with a shake of the head. "I tell you that I saw it." "Saw it?" replied the sexton. "Aye, but Davy, women don't always tell the truth about their age." "That's true indeed," said the other old man, with a sudden sparkle in his eye. "She might have been older. I'm sure she must have been. I only think how old she looked. You and I seemed but boys to her." "She did look old," rejoined David. "You're right. She did look old." "Call to mind how old she looked for many a long, long year, and say if she could be but 79 at last, only our age," said the sexton. 5 year older at the very least," cried the other. 5, retorted the sexton. 10, good 89. I call to mind the time her daughter died. She was 89 if she was a day, and tries to pass upon us now for 10 years younger. Oh, human vanity!" The other old man was not behindhand with some moral reflections on this fruitful theme, and both adduced a mass of evidence, of such weight as to render it doubtful, not whether the deceased was of the age suggested, but whether she had not almost reached the patriarchal term of 100. When they had settled this question to their mutual satisfaction, the sexton, with his friend's assistance, rose to go. "It's chilly sitting here, and I must be careful till the summer," he said, as he prepared to limp away. "What?" asked old David. "He's very deaf, poor fellow," cried the sexton.
Good-bye.'
'Ah!' said old David, looking after him. 'He's failing very fast. He ages every day.' And so they parted, each persuaded that the other had less life in him than himself, and both greatly consoled and comforted by the little fiction they had agreed upon respecting Becky Morgan, whose decease was no longer a precedent of uncomfortable application, and would be no business of theirs for half a score of years to come. The child remained for some minutes watching the deaf old man as he threw out the earth with his shovel, and often stopping to cough and fetch his breath, still muttered to himself, with a kind of sober chuckle, that the sexton was wearing fast. At length she turned away, and walking thoughtfully through the churchyard, came unexpectedly upon the schoolmaster, who was sitting on a green grave in the sun, reading. 'Nell here,' he said cheerfully, as he closed his book. 'It does me good to see you in the air and light. I feared you were again in the church, where you so often are.'
'Feared?' replied the child, sitting down beside him. 'Is it not a good place?'
'Yes, yes,' said the schoolmaster, 'but you must be gay sometimes. Nay, don't shake your head and smile so sadly.'
'Not sadly, if you knew my heart. Do not look at me as if you thought me sorrowful. There is not a happier creature on earth than I am now.' Full of grateful tenderness, the child took his hand and folded it between her own. 'It's God's will,' she said, when they had been silent for some time.
'What?'
'All this,' she rejoined. 'All this about us. But which of us is sad now? You see that I am smiling.'
'And so am I,' said the schoolmaster, 'smiling to think how often we shall laugh in this same place. Were you not talking yonder?'
'Yes,'
the child rejoined. 'Of something that has made you sorrowful?' There was a long pause. 'What was it?' said the schoolmaster tenderly. 'Come, tell me what it was.'
'I rather grieve. I do rather grieve to think,' said the child, bursting into tears, 'that those who die about us are so soon forgotten.'
'And do you think,' said the schoolmaster, marking the glance she had thrown around, 'that an unvisited grave, a withered tree, a faded flower or two, are tokens of forgetfulness or cold neglect? Do you think there are no deeds far away from here, in which these dead may be best remembered? Nell, Nell, there may be people busy in the world at this instant, in whose good actions and good thoughts these very graves, neglected as they look to us, are the chief instruments.'
'Tell me no more,' said the child quickly. 'Tell me no more. I feel I know it. How could I be unmindful of it when I thought of you?'
'There is nothing,' cried her friend, 'no, nothing innocent or good that dies and is forgotten. Let us hold to that faith, or none. An infant, a prattling child, dying in its cradle, will live again in the better thoughts of those who loved it, and will play its part, through them, in the redeeming actions of the world, though its body be burnt to ashes, or drowned in the deepest sea. There is not an angel added to the host of heaven, but does its blessed work on earth in those that loved it here. Forgotten! Oh, if the good deeds of human creatures could be traced to their source, how beautiful would even death appear! For how much charity, mercy, and purified affection would be seen to have their growth in dusty graves!
'Yes,' said the child, 'it is the truth. I know it is. Who should feel its force so much as I, in whom your little scholar lives again? Dear, dear good friend, if you knew the comfort you have given me!
The poor schoolmaster made her no answer, but bent over her in silence, for his heart was full. They were yet seated in the same place when the grandfather approached. Before they had spoken many words together, the church clock struck the hour of school, and their friend withdrew. 'A good man,' said the grandfather, looking after him. 'A kind man. Surely he will never harm us, Nell. We are safe here at last, eh? We will never go away from here?' The child shook her head and smiled. 'She needs rest,' said the old man, patting her cheek. 'Too pale, too pale. She is not like what she was.'
'When?'
asked the child. 'Ah!' said the old man. 'To be sure. When? How many weeks ago? Could I count them on my fingers? Let them rest, though. They're better gone.'
'Much better, dear,' replied the child. 'We will forget them, or if we ever call them to mind, it shall be only as some uneasy dream that has passed away.'
'Hush!' said the old man, motioning hastily to her with his hand, and looking over his shoulder. 'No more talk of the dream, and all the miseries it brought. There are no dreams here. 'Tis a quiet place, and they keep away. Let us never think about them, lest they should pursue us again. Sunken eyes and hollow cheeks, wet, cold, and famine, and horrors before them all that were even worse. We must forget such things if we would be tranquil here.'
'Thank Heaven,'
inwardly exclaimed the child,
'for this most happy change!'
'I will be patient,' said the old man, 'humble, very thankful, and obedient, if you will let me stay. But do not hide from me, do not steal away alone. Let me keep beside you. Indeed, I will be very true and faithful, Nell.'
'I steal away alone? Why that,' replied the child, with assumed gaiety, 'would be a pleasant jest indeed. See here, dear grandfather, we'll make this place our garden. Why not? It is a very good one, and to-morrow we'll begin and work together, side by side.'
'It is a brave thought!' cried her grandfather. 'Mind, darling, we begin to-morrow.' Who so delighted as the old man, when they next day began their labour? Who so unconscious of all associations connected with the spot as he? They plucked the long grass and nettles from the tombs, thinned the poor shrubs and roots, made the turf smooth, and cleared it of the leaves and weeds. They were yet in the ardour of their work, when the child, raising her head from the ground over which she bent, observed that the bachelor was sitting on the stile close by, watching them in silence. 'A kind office,' said the little gentleman, nodding to Nell as she curtsied to him. 'Have you done all that this morning?'
'It is very little, sir,' returned the child, with downcast eyes, 'to what we mean to do.'
'Good work, good work,' said the bachelor. 'But do you only labour at the graves of children and young people?'
'We shall come to the others in good time, sir,' replied Nell, turning her head aside, and speaking softly. It was a slight incident, and might have been design or accident, or the child's unconscious sympathy with youth, but it seemed to strike upon her grandfather, though he had not noticed it before. He looked in a hurried manner at the graves, then anxiously at the child, then pressed her to his side and bade her stop to rest. Something he had long forgotten appeared to struggle faintly in his mind. It did not pass away, as weightier things had done, but came uppermost again, and yet again, and many times that day, and often afterwards. Once, while they were yet at work, the child, seeing that he often turned and looked uneasily at her, as though he were trying to resolve some painful doubts or collect some scattered thoughts,
urged him to tell the reason. But he said it was nothing, nothing, and, laying her head upon his arm, patted her fair cheek with his hand, and muttered that she grew stronger every day, and would be a woman soon. End of chapter 54. Of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 55. From that time there sprung up in the old man's mind a solicitude about the child which never slept or left him. There are chords in the human heart, strange, varying strings, which are only struck by accident, which will remain mute and senseless to appeals the most passionate and earnest, and respond at last to the slightest casual touch. In the most insensible or childish minds, there is some train of reflection which art can seldom lead, or skill assist, but which will reveal itself, as great truths have done, by chance, and when the discoverer has the plainest end in view. From that time the old man never for a moment forgot the weakness and devotion of the child. From the time of that slight incident, he who had seen her toiling by his side through so much difficulty and suffering, and had scarcely thought of her otherwise than as the partner of miseries which he felt severely in his own person, and deplored for his own sake at least as much as hers, awoke to a sense of what he owed her, and what those miseries had made her. Never, no, never once, in one unguarded moment from that time to the end, did any care for himself, any thought of his own comfort, any selfish consideration or regard, distract his thoughts from the gentle object of his love. He would follow her up and down, waiting till she should tire, and lean upon his arm. He would sit opposite to her in the chimney-corner, content to watch and look until she raised her head and smiled upon him as of old. He would discharge by stealth those household duties which tasked her powers too heavily. He would rise, in the cold dark nights, to listen to her breathing in her sleep, and sometimes crouch for hours by her bedside, only to touch her hand. He who knows all can only know what hopes and fears and thoughts of deep affection were in that one disordered brain, and what a change had fallen on the poor old man. Sometimes weeks had crept on, then the child, exhausted, though with little fatigue, would pass whole evenings on a couch beside the fire. At such times the schoolmaster would bring in books, and read to her aloud, and seldom an evening passed but the bachelor came in and took his turn of reading. The old man sat and listened, with little understanding for the words, but with his eyes fixed upon the child, and if she smiled or brightened with the story, he would say it was a good one, and conceive a fondness for the very book. When in their evening talk the bachelor told some tale that pleased her, as his tales were sure to do, the old man would painfully try to store it in his mind. Nay, when the bachelor left them, he would sometimes slip out after him, and humbly beg that he would tell him such a part again, that he might learn to win a smile from Nell. But these were rare occasions, happily, for the child yearned to be out of doors and walking in her solemn garden. Parties, too, would come to see the church, and those who came, speaking to others of the child, sent more, so even at that season of the year they had visitors almost daily. The old man would follow them at a little distance through the building, listening to the voice he loved so well, and when the strangers left and parted from Nell, he would mingle with them to catch up fragments of their conversation, or he would stand for the same purpose, with his grey head uncovered, at the gate as they passed through. They always praised the child, her sense and beauty, and he was proud to hear them. But what was that, so often added, which wrung his heart and made him sob and weep alone in some dull corner? Alas, even careless strangers, they who had no feeling for her but the interest of the moment, They who would go away and forget next week that such a being lived, even they saw it, even they pitied her, even they bade him good day compassionately, and whispered as they passed. The people of the village, too, of whom there was not one but grew to have a fondness for poor Nell, even among them there was the same feeling, a tenderness towards her, a compassionate regard for her, increasing every day. The very schoolboys, light-hearted and thoughtless as they were, even they cared for her. The roughest among them was sorry if he missed her in the usual place upon his way to school, and would turn out of the path to ask for her at the latticed window. If she were sitting in the church, they perhaps might peep in softly at the open door, but they never spoke to her, unless she rose and went to speak to them. Some feeling was abroad which raised the child above them all. So when Sunday came, they were all poor country people in the church, for the castle in which the old family had lived was an empty ruin, and there were none but humble folks for 7 miles around. There, as elsewhere, they had an interest in Nell. They would gather round her in the porch, before and after service. Young children would cluster at her skirts, and aged men and women forsake their gossips to give her kindly greeting. None of them, young or old, thought of passing the child without a friendly word. Many who came from 3 or 4 miles distant brought her little presents. The humblest and rudest had good wishes to bestow. She had sought out the young children whom she first saw playing in the churchyard. One of these, he who had spoken of his brother, was her little favourite and friend, and often sat by her side in the church, or climbed with her to the tower top. It was his delight to help her, or to fancy that he did so, and they soon became close companions. It happened that as she was reading in the old spot by herself one day, this child came running in, with his eyes full of tears, and after holding her from him, and looking at her eagerly for a moment, clasped his little arms passionately about her neck. 'What now?' said Nell, soothing him. 'What is the matter?'
'She is not one yet,'
cried the boy, embracing her still more closely.
'No, no, not yet.'
She looked at him wonderingly, and putting his hair back from his face, and kissing him, asked what he meant.
'You must not be one, dear Nell,'
cried the boy.
'We can't see them. They never come to play with us, or talk to us. Be what you are. You are better so.'
'I do not understand you,' said the child. 'Tell me what you mean.'
'Why, they say,'
replied the boy, looking up into her face,
'that you will be an angel before the birds sing again. But you won't be, will you? Don't leave us, Nell, though the sky is bright. Do not leave us.'
The child dropped her head, and put her hands before her face.
'She cannot bear the thought,'
cried the boy, exulting through his tears.
'You will not go. You know how sorry we should be. Dear Nell, tell me that you'll stay amongst us. Oh, pray, pray, tell me that you will.'
The little creature folded his hands and knelt down at her feet.
'Only look at me, Nell,'
said the boy,
'and tell me that you'll stop, and then I shall know that they are wrong, and will cry no more. Won't you say yes, Nell?'
Still the drooping head and hidden face, and the child quite silent, save for her sobs.
'After a time,' pursued the boy, trying to draw away her hand, 'the kind angels will be glad to think that you are not among them, and that you stay here to be with us. Willie went away to join them, but if he had known how I should miss him in our little bed at night, he never would have left me, I am sure.'
Yet the child could make him no answer, and sobbed as though her heart were bursting.
'Why would you go, dear Nell? know you would not be happy when you heard that we were crying for your loss. They say that Willie is in heaven now, and that it's always summer there, and yet I'm sure he grieves when I lie down upon his garden bed, and he cannot turn to kiss me. But if you do go, Nell,' said the boy, caressing her and pressing his face to hers, 'be fond of him for my sake. Tell him how I love him still, and how much I loved you. And when I think that you two are together and are happy, I'll try to bear it, and never give you pain by doing wrong. Indeed, I never will.'
The child suffered him to move her hands, and put them round his neck. There was a tearful silence, but it was not long before she looked upon him with a smile, and promised him in a very gentle, quiet voice that she would stay, and be his friend as long as Heaven would let her. He clapped his hands for joy, and thanked her many times, and being charged to tell no person what had passed between them, gave her an earnest promise that he never would. Nor did he, so far as the child could learn, but was her quiet companion in all her walks and musings, and never again adverted to the theme, which he felt had given her pain, although he was unconscious of its cause. Something of distrust lingered about him still, for he would often come, even in the dark evenings, and call in a timid voice outside the door to know if she were safe within, and being answered yes, and bade to enter, would take his station on a low stool at her feet, and sit there patiently until they came to seek and take him home. Sure as the morning came, it found him lingering near the house to ask if she were well, and, morning, noon, or night, go where she would, he would forsake his playmates and his sports to bear her company.
'And a good little friend he is too,' said the old sexton to her once. 'When his elder brother died, elder seems a strange word, for he was only 7 years old, I remember this one took it sorely to heart.' The child thought of what the schoolmaster had told her, and felt how its truth was shadowed out even in this infant. 'It has given him something of a quiet way, I think,' said the old man, 'though for that he is merry enough at times, I'd wager now that you and he have been listening by the old well.'
'Indeed we have not,' the child replied. 'I have been afraid to go near it, for I am not often down in that part of the church, and do not know the ground.' 'Come down with me,' said the old man. 'I have known it from a boy. Come.' They descended the narrow steps which led into the crypt, and paused among the gloomy arches in a dim and murky spot. 'This is the place,' said the old man. 'Give me your hand while you throw back the cover, lest you should stumble and fall in. I am too old, I mean rheumatic, to stoop myself.' 'A black and dreadful place!' exclaimed the child. 'Look in,' said the old man, pointing downward with his finger. The child complied, and gazed down into the pit. 'It looks like a grave itself,' said the old man. 'It does,' replied the child. 'I have often had the fancy,' said the sexton, 'that it might have been dug at first to make the old place more gloomy, and the old monks more religious. It's to be closed up and built over.' The child still stood, looking thoughtfully into the vault. 'We shall see,' said the sexton, 'on what gay heads other earth will have closed when the light is shut out from here. God knows they'll close it up next spring.' 'The birds sing again in spring,'
thought the child, as she leaned at her casement window and gazed at the declining sun.
'Spring, a beautiful and happy time.
End of chapter 55. 56 of the Old Curiosity Shop. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Mil Nicholson. The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. Chapter 56. A day or two after the Quilp tea party at the Wilderness, Mr Swiveller walked into Sampson Brass's office at the usual hour, and being alone in that temple of probity, placed his hat upon the desk, and taking from his pocket a small parcel of black crape, applied himself to folding and pinning the same upon it, after the manner of a hatband. Having completed the construction of this appendage, he surveyed his work with great complacency, and put his hat on again, very much over one eye, to increase the mournfulness of the effect. These arrangements perfected to his entire satisfaction, he thrust his hands into his pockets, and walked up and down the office with measured steps. 'It has always been the same with me,' said Mr Swiveller. 'Always. 'Twas ever thus. From childhood's hour I have seen my fondest hopes decay. I never loved a tree or flower, but 'twas the first to fade away. I never nursed a dear gazelle to glad me with its soft black eye, but when it came to know me well and love me, it was sure to marry a market gardener.' Overpowered by these reflections, Mr Swiveller stopped short at the client's chair, and flung himself into its open arms. 'And this,' said Mr Swiveller, with a kind of bantering composure, 'is life, I believe? Oh, certainly. Why not? I am quite satisfied. I shall wear,' added Richard, taking off his hat again and looking hard at it, as if he were only deterred by pecuniary considerations from spurning it with his foot, 'I shall wear this emblem of woman's perfidy, in remembrance of her with whom I shall never again thread the windings of the mazy, whom I shall never more pledge in the rosy, who, during the short remainder of my existence, will murder the balmy. Ha, ha, ha!' It may be necessary to observe, lest there should appear any incongruity in the close of this soliloquy, that Mr Swiveller did not wind up with a cheerful hilarious laugh, which would have been undoubtedly at variance with his solemn reflections, but that, being in a theatrical mood, he merely achieved that performance which is designated in melodramas, laughing like a fiend, for it seems that your fiend always laugh in syllables, and always in 3 syllables, never more nor less, which is a remarkable property in such gentry, and one worthy of remembrance. The baleful sounds had hardly died away, and Mr Swiveller was still sitting in a very grim state in the client's chair, when there came a ring, or, if we may adapt the sound to this then humour, a knell, at the office bell. Opening the door with all speed, he beheld the expressive countenance of Mr Chuckster, between whom and himself a fraternal greeting ensued. 'You're devilish early at this pestiferous old slaughter-house,' said that gentleman, poising himself on one leg, and shaking the other in an easy manner. 'Rather,' returned Dick. 'Rather,' retorted Mr Chuckster, with that air of graceful trifling which so well became him. 'I should think so. Why, my good feller, do you know what o'clock it is? 9:30 a.m. in the morning.' 'Won't you come in?' said Dick. 'All alone? Swiveller solus. 'Tis now the witching hour of night, when churchyards yawn, and graves give up their dead.' At the end of this quotation in dialogue, each gentleman struck an attitude, and immediately subsiding into prose, walked into the office. Such morsels of enthusiasm are common among the glorious Apollos, and were indeed the links that bound them together and raised them above the cold dull earth. 'Well, and how are you, my buck?' said Mr Chuckster, taking a stool. 'I was forced to come into the city upon some little private matters of my own, and couldn't pass the corner of the street without looking in. But upon my soul I didn't expect to find you. It is so everlastingly early.' Mr Swiveller expressed his acknowledgments, and it appearing on further conversation that he was in good health, and that Mr Chuckster was in the like enviable condition, both gentlemen, in compliance with the solemn custom of the ancient brotherhood to which they belonged, joined in a fragment of the popular duet of All's Well, with a long shake at the end. 'And what's the news?' said Richard. 'The town's as flat, my dear fellow,'
replied Mr Chuckster, as the surface of a Dutch oven. There's no news. By the by, that lodger of yours is a most extraordinary person. He quite eludes the most vigorous comprehension, you know. Never was such a fellow.'
'What has he been doing now?' said Dick.
'By Jove, sir,' returned Mr Chuckster, taking out an oblong snuff box, the lid whereof was ornamented with a fox's head, curiously carved in brass, 'that man is an unfathomable. Sir, that man has made friends with our articled clerk. There's no harm in him. He is so amazingly slow and soft. Now, if he wanted a friend, why couldn't he have one that knew a thing or two, and could do him some good by his manners and conversation? I have my faults, sir,' said Mr Chuckster.
'No, no,'
interposed Mr Swiveller. 'Oh yes, I have. I have my faults. No man knows his faults better than I know mine. But,' said Mr Chuckster, 'I'm not meek. My worst enemies, every man has his enemies, sir, and I have mine, never accused me of being meek. And I'll tell you what, sir, if I hadn't more of these qualities that commonly endear man to man than our articled clerk has, I'd steal a Cheshire cheese, tie it round my neck, and drown myself. I'd die degraded as I had lived. I would, 'pon my honour.' Mr Chuckster paused, rapped the fox's head exactly on the nose with the knuckle of the forefinger, took a pinch of snuff, and looked steadily at Mr Swiveller, as much as to say that if he thought he was going to sneeze, he would find himself mistaken. 'Not contented, sir,' said Mr Chuckster, 'with making friends with Abel, he has cultivated the acquaintance of his father and mother. Since he came home from that wild goose chase, he has been there, actually been there. He patronises young Snobby besides. You'll find, sir, that he'll be constantly coming backwards and forwards to this place. Yet I don't suppose that beyond the common forms of civility he has ever exchanged half a dozen words with me. Now, upon my soul, you know,' said Mr Chuckster, shaking his head gravely, as men are wont to do when they consider things are going a little too far, 'this is altogether such a low-minded affair, that if I didn't feel for the governor, and know that he could never get on without me, I should be obliged to cut the connection. I should have no alternative.' Mr Swiveller, who sat on another stool opposite to his friend, stirred the fire in an excess of sympathy, but said nothing. 'As to young Snob, sir,' pursued Mr Chuckster with a prophetic look, 'you'll find he'll turn out bad. In our profession we know something of human nature, and take my word for it, that feller that came back to work out that shilling will show himself one of these days in his true colours. He's a low thief, sir. He must be.' Mr Chuckster, being roused, would probably have pursued this subject further, and in more emphatic language, but for a tap at the door, which, seeming to announce the arrival of somebody on business, caused him to assume a greater appearance of meekness than was perhaps quite consistent with his late declaration. Mr Swiveller, hearing the same sound, caused his stool to revolve rapidly on one leg until it brought him to his desk, into which, having forgotten in the sudden flurry of his spirits to part with the poker, he thrust it as he cried, 'Come in!' Who should present himself but that very Kit who had been the theme of Mr Chuckster's wrath. Never did man pluck up his courage so quickly, or look so fierce, as Mr Chuckster when he found it was he. Mr Swiveller stared at him for a moment, and then leaping from his stool, and drawing out the poker from its place of concealment, performed the broadsword exercise with all the cuts and guards complete, in a species of frenzy. 'Is the gentleman at home?' said Kit, rather astonished by this uncommon reception. Before Mr Swiveller could make any reply, Mr Chuckster took occasion to enter his indignant protest against this form of inquiry, which he held to be of a disrespectful and snobbish tendency, inasmuch as the inquirer, seeing two gentlemen then and there present, should have spoken of the other gentleman, or rather, for it was not impossible that the object of his search might be of inferior quality, should have mentioned his name, leaving it to his hearers to determine his degree as they thought proper. Mr Chuckster likewise remarked that he had some reason to believe this form of address was personal to himself, and that he was not a man to be trifled with, as certain snobs, whom he did not more particularly mention or describe, might find to their cost. 'I mean the gentleman upstairs,' said Kit,
turning to Richard Swiveller.
'Is he at home?'
'Why?' rejoined Dick.
'Because if he is, I have a letter for him.'
'From whom?' said Dick.
'From Mr Garland.'
'Oh!' said Dick, with extreme politeness.
'Then you may hand it over, sir. And if you're to wait for an answer, sir, you may wait in the passage, sir, which is an airy and well ventilated apartment, sir.' 'Thank you,' returned Kit. 'But I am to give it to himself, if you please.'
The excessive audacity of this retort so overpowered Mr Chuckster, and so moved his tender regard for his friend's honour, that he declared, if he were not restrained by official considerations, he must certainly have annihilated Kit upon the spot. A resentment of the affront, which he did consider, under the extraordinary circumstances of aggravation attending it, could but have met with proper sanction and approval of a jury of Englishmen, who, he had no doubt, would have returned a verdict of justifiable homicide, coupled with a high testimony to the morals and character of the avenger. Mr Swiveller, without being quite so hot upon the matter, was rather shamed by his friend's excitement, and not a little puzzled how to act, Kit being quite cool and good humoured, when the single gentleman was heard to call violently down the stairs.
'Didn't I see somebody for me come in?' cried the lodger.
'Yes, sir,' replied Dick. 'Certainly, sir.'
'Then where is he?' roared the single gentleman.
'He's here, sir,' rejoined Mr Swiveller. 'Now, young man, don't you hear you're to go upstairs? Are you deaf?'
Kit did not appear to think it worth his while to enter into any altercation, but hurried off and left the glorious Apollos gazing at each other in silence. 'Didn't I tell you so?' said Mr Chuckster. 'What do you think of that?' Mr Swiveller, being in the main a good-natured fellow, and not perceiving in the conduct of Kit any villainy of enormous magnitude, scarcely knew what answer to return. He was relieved from his perplexity, however, by the entrance of Mr Sampson and his sister, Sally, at sight of whom Mr Chuckster precipitately retired. Mr Brass and his lovely companion appeared to have been holding a consultation over their temperate breakfast, upon some matter of great interest and importance. On the occasion of such conferences, they generally appeared in the office some half an hour after their usual time, in a very smiling state, as though their late plots and designs had tranquillized their minds and shed a light upon their toilsome way. In the present instance they seemed particularly gay, Miss Sally's aspect being of a most oily kind, and Mr Brass rubbing his hands in an exceedingly jocose and light-hearted manner.
'Well, Mr Richard,' said Brass, 'how are we this morning? Are we pretty fresh and cheerful, sir? Eh, Mr Richard?'
'Pretty well, sir,' replied Dick.
'That's well,' said Brass. 'Ha ha ha! We should be as gay as larks, Mr Richard. Why not? It's a pleasant world we live in, sir, a very pleasant world. There are bad people in it, Mr Richard, but if there were no bad people, there would be no good lawyers. Ha ha ha! Any letters by the post this morning, Mr Richard?'
Mr Swiveller answered in the negative.
'Ha!' said Brass. 'No matter. If there's little business to-day, there'll be more to-morrow. A contented spirit, Mr Richard, is the sweetness of existence. Anybody been here, sir?'
'Only my friend,' replied Dick. 'May we ne'er want a—'
'Friend!' Brass chimed in quickly. 'Or a bottle to give him. Ha 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 ha! That's the way the song runs, isn't it? Very good song, Mr Richard, very good. I like the sentiment of it. Ha 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 ha! Your friend's the young man from Witherden's office, I think. Yes? May we ne'er want a... Nobody else at all been, Mr Richard?'
'Only somebody to the lodger,' replied Mr Swiveller.
'Oh, indeed!' cried Brass. 'Somebody to the lodger, eh? Ha ha ha! Ah, may we ne'er want a friend, or a... somebody to the lodger, eh, Mr Richard?'
'Yes,' said Dick, a little disconcerted by the excessive buoyancy of spirits which his employer displayed. 'With him now.
With him now!' cried Brass. 'Ha ha ha! Ah, there! Let 'em be merry and free, toorl-rool! Hey, Mr Richard! Ha ha ha!'
'Oh, certainly,' replied Dick.
'And who,' said Brass, shuffling among his papers, 'who is the lodger's visitor? Not a lady visitor, I hope, eh, Mr Richard? The morals of the marks, you know, sir, when lovely woman stoops to folly, and all that, eh, Mr Richard?'
'Another young man who belongs to Witherden's too, or half belongs there,' returned Richard. 'Kit they call him.'
'Kit, eh?' said Brass. 'Strange name. Name of a dancing master's fiddle, eh, Mr Richard? Ha ha ha! Ah, Kit's there, is he? Oh!'
Dick looked at Miss Sally, wondering that she didn't check this uncommon exuberance on the part of Mr Sampson. But as she made no attempt to do so, and rather appeared to exhibit a tacit acquiescence in it, he concluded they had just been cheating somebody and receiving the bill.
'Will you have the goodness, Mr Richard,' said Brass, taking a letter from his desk, 'just to step over to Peckham Rye with that? There's no answer, but it's rather particular, and should go by hand. Charge the office with your coach hire back, you know. Don't spare the office. Get as much out of it as you can. Clerk's motto, eh, Mr Richard? Ha ha ha!'
Mr Swiveller solemnly doffed the aquatic jacket, put on his coat, took down his hat from its peg, pocketed the letter, and departed. As soon as he was gone, up rose Miss Sally Brass, and smiling sweetly at her brother, who nodded and smote his nose in return, withdrew also. Sampson Brass was no sooner left alone than he set the office door wide open, and establishing himself at his desk directly opposite, so that he could not fail to see anybody who came downstairs and passed out at the street door, began to write with extreme cheerfulness and assiduity, humming as he did so, in a voice that was anything but musical, certain vocal snatches which appeared to have reference to the union between church and state, inasmuch as they were compounded of the evening hymn and God Save the King. Thus the attorney of Bevis Marks sat, and wrote, and hummed, for a long time, except when he stopped to listen with a very cunning face, and hearing nothing, went on humming louder and writing slower than ever. At length, in one of these pauses, he heard his lodger's door opened and shut, and footsteps coming down the stairs. Then Mr Brass left off writing entirely, and, with his pen in his hand, hummed his very loudest, shaking his head meanwhile from side to side, like a man whose whole soul was in the music, and smiling in a manner quite seraphic. It was towards this moving spectacle that the staircase and the sweet sounds guided Kit, on whose arrival before his door, Mr Brass stopped his singing, but not his smiling, and nodded affably, at the same time beckoning to him with his pen. 'Kit,' said Mr Brass, in the pleasantest way imaginable, 'how do you do?' Kit, being rather shy of his friend, made a suitable reply, and had his hand upon the lock of the street door when Mr Brass called him softly back. 'You are not to go, if you please, Kit,' said the attorney in a mysterious and yet businesslike way. 'You are to step in here, if you please. Dear me, when I look at you,' said the lawyer, quitting his stool and standing before the fire with his back towards it, 'I am reminded of the sweetest little face that ever my eyes beheld. I remember your coming there twice or thrice when we were in possession. Ah, Kit, my dear fellow, gentlemen in my profession have such painful duties to perform sometimes, that you needn't envy us. You needn't indeed.'
'I don't, sir,' said Kit, 'though it isn't for the like of me to judge.'
'Our only consolation, Kit,' pursued the lawyer, looking at him in a sort of pensive abstraction, 'is that although we cannot turn away the wind, we can soften it, we can temper it, if I may say so, to the shorn lambs.' 'Shorn indeed,' thought Kit. 'Pretty close. But he didn't say so. 'On that occasion, Kit,' said Mr Brass. 'On that occasion that I have just alluded to, I had a hard battle with Mr Quilp, for Mr Quilp is a very hard man, to obtain them the indulgence they had. It might have cost me a client, but suffering virtue inspired me, and I prevailed.'
'He's not so bad after all,' thought honest Kit, as the attorney pursed up his lips and looked like a man who was struggling with his better feelings.
'I respect you, Kit,' said Brass with emotion. 'I saw enough of your conduct at that time to respect you, though your station is humble and your fortune lowly. It isn't the waistcoat that I look at, it is the heart. The checks in the waistcoat are but the wires of the cage, but the heart is the bird. Ah! How many such birds are perpetually moulting, and putting their beaks through the wires to peck at all mankind!'
This poetic figure, which Kit took to be an especial allusion to his own checked waistcoat, quite overcame him. Mr Brass's voice and manner added not a little to its effect, for he discoursed with all the mild austerity of a hermit, and wanted but a cord round the waist of his rusty surtout, and a skull on the chimney-piece, to be completely set up in that line of business.
'Well, well,'
said Sampson, smiling as good men smile when they compassionate their own weakness, or that of their fellow creatures.
'this is wide of the bull's eye. You're to take that, if you please.'
As he spoke, he pointed to a couple of half-crowns on the desk. Kit looked at the coins, and then at Sampson, and hesitated.
'For yourself,' said Brass.
'From—'
'No matter about the person they came from,' replied the lawyer. 'Say me, if you like. We have eccentric friends overhead, Kit, and we mustn't ask questions or talk too much. You understand? You're to take them, that's all, and between you and me, I don't think they'll be the last you'll have to take from the same place. I hope not. Good bye, Kit. Good bye.'
With many thanks, and many more self-reproaches for having on such slight grounds suspected one who in their very first conversation turned out such a different man from what he had supposed, Kit took the money and made the best of his way home. Mr Brass remained airing himself at the fire, and resumed his vocal exercise and his seraphic smile simultaneously.
'May I come in?'
said Miss Sally, peeping.
'Oh yes, you may come in,' returned her brother.
'Ahem!' coughed Miss Brass, interrogatively.
'Why, yes,' returned Sampson. 'I should say as good as done.'
End of chapter 56.